Hi, everyone. Doc T here with another episode of the Horses Advocate podcast. Welcome to 2024. This is the first one. And I am going to first thank everybody who has become a member of the Horses Advocate. I can't tell you how grateful I am, and the horses and how grateful they are. I just heard a great, wonderful comment from a client today who said she switched her horses over to no grain diet and no supplements and soybean meal. And she was blown away with the improvements of her horse. It just made everything phenomenal for her. So she's just thrilled. And that thrills me. And I know that there are so many of you out there listening to this who have tried helping your horses in one way or the other by listening to these podcasts and are receiving great results. Not all of you are getting them. Some of you are finding horses aren't responding the way you expected. And that's where joining the Horse Advocate really makes a big difference, because you can bring your questions and concerns to our meetings every other Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, where you can ask your questions directly to me and we can hash these things out. The other thing that is so important is I'm looking around this beautiful studio that I've got right now, and I've got a real wall behind me, not a green screen. My son has come home for a month or so to help me build my new studio, and I'm grateful for his input and how well it works. This is my second attempt, believe it or not, at this podcast, because the first one was an utter failure. So we're going to stick with one camera. I'd like to have two cameras at some point, but right now I haven't figured out how to blend two in Adobe Premiere Pro. So bear with me. I'm going to be using the whiteboard to explain some things as we go through our first podcast this season. For the next several podcasts, I want to focus on how to feed the horse, but I also want to focus on making it very, very simple. The reason I want to do this is feedback that I get from my clients as I go from farm to farm, who get it, but don't get it all the way. And when you don't get it all the way, if something doesn't go right, you immediately go back to what you're doing because it's what you know. Also, when people in the barn tell you that you're crazy, which is so common, they will bully you if you don't have the ability to stand up to it with information. So I've found that in today's world, we are so filled with ideas of things. Just the holidays have just passed, and we are inundated with family, friends, commitments. It's just overwhelming. And in this day and age, we are overwhelmed with information. So it is my goal in 2024 to take everything that I know, whether it's dentistry or equine nutrition or any other topic that I want to talk about, and break it down into small bite-sized pieces that you can listen to and you can really, really understand it, repeat it, and then build on it. So I want to start by talking about what are the things that go into a horse's mouth, some of the basics of what actually is going on in the horse's digestive system, how those pieces go from raw materials that are in your bale of hay or whatever you're putting in front of the horse into the essentials that fuel the body and keep it healthy. And we're going to take one at a time, and then we're going to build the relationships between those. And then we're going to talk about how it goes wrong in all these diseases that we flippantly say insulin resistance or equine metabolic syndrome or Cushing's disease, where we really don't have a strong understanding that there is a depth to it, that once you get it, once you understand the basic principles behind it, it'll all fall into place. So without much further introduction, I just want to, again, thank everybody for being here and listening to this podcast. My goal is to put one out every Wednesday morning. in the 2024 year until about Thanksgiving next November, when I'll probably again take a month off where I can just kind of regroup, which is what I did. And this is why you haven't heard me for the past several weeks. My son came to visit all the way from the other side of the planet. And it's just time that I just stop. Plus, December is my busiest time of year as a dentist, taking care of horses' teeth. It just is almost nonstop. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to share the screen. Here we go. Okay, great. So this is going to be talking about glucose. And glucose is basically sugar. And sugar is the main component of, or glucose is the main sugar molecule of life. So it's primary, but there's others. There's fructose, and there's sucrose, and there's lactose. So it's very similar. But I want to go down into the basics of things. Now, I've jumped on this, what I call a carousel. This carousel is simply put a merry-go-round of nutrition, and it's hard to just jump on without just jumping on. In other words, you don't know where. You watch the horses go by, and then you say, okay, let me jump on here. And this is where I jumped on glucose. So why did I jump on glucose? Well, simply put, I wanted to tell you that there's about 6 or 7 things that go into the mouth. And when I say into the mouth, I want you to understand that what goes into the mouth is outside your body. That is one of the critical things to understand. So there's a tube that runs from your mouth, and it goes all the way to the anus where poop comes out. Now, I'm sorry if that word poop offends you. I don't know what else to tell you, but you're all horse people, and you know that up front is money that goes in, what we call hay, etc. But it's usually money, especially if you're not the horse owner, but the horse provider. Anyway, and it comes out as poop. That's the old joke. But the point that I want to make here is all along this path, ingredients come in and they start to come out. And once they start coming out, then it's called nutrition. Right now, it is just raw materials. And what comes out of that are basically 6 or 7 things. Now, 2 of them I'm not really going to discuss. Let's just list them for what they are. Okay. Number 1, of course, is air. And nobody here is going to argue with me. If you don't get air, you die. And you only have a few minutes before you stop breathing. Air is that important. We all understand that. Air just went into my body. It is being metabolized, utilized, and then excreted as carbon dioxide. So air is mostly nitrogen. And this is what really blows people's minds. It's 78% nitrogen and then oxygen. And we all think oxygen is everything, but it's not. It's about 20%. So if you're good with math, we're just going to call this other, and we'll just give it 2%. So that's basically what it is. If you're a scuba diver, you mix these things, you add some helium, you turn up the nitrogen, or you turn up the oxygen, I should say, and decrease the nitrogen. And that's games that we play as scuba divers, but we're not scuba divers. We are horse owners, and we want to know what to do. And horses breathe air. End of discussion on that. Number 2 is water. And we all will agree that we can live without water for a little bit, but after a while, we become dehydrated and then we die. So water is really, really important. I don't know how long it would take, but it's days. All right. So water, and what's interesting about water is it also has minerals. And The minerals are only found in water that comes out of the well. If it is rainwater that's collected into a cistern and used for watering your horses, please understand that that is distilled water and that doesn't have the minerals. They have all fallen out as the water is evaporated into the clouds and then comes back down. It can have some other things. It can actually be very acidic. They call it acid rain, and that can affect the microbiome of the horse. So be careful with water, but that's another one we're not going to discuss. So that leaves us 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This one is going to be a big question mark, mainly because we know that it exists, but we really don't know much about it in humans, let alone horses. But we're going to call them, let's just call them polyphenols. And these are chemical compounds that are found in plants that help us maintain the gut microbiome and keep them healthy. I've just received my dose of specialized polyphenols for my own body. But if you drink coffee, you're getting polyphenols, or eating dark berries such as cherries, pomegranates, blueberries, things like that, you're going to get rich polyphenols. Maybe you've heard of resveratrol, but that's in this class of compounds. And again, I don't want to go over that because honestly, that's not helping us. Not today. We need to get down to the very, very core of understanding what is going in the horse's mouth. So now we have 1, 2, 3. What else is left? Number 4, we'll call it minerals. And what's interesting about minerals is everyone's got an idea about what they are. And we keep saying that the horse is lacking minerals. And we can even say vitamins, minerals, because a lot of people like to group vitamins with minerals. I've got to tell you that there's very little understood about vitamins and minerals. There are some basics that are truisms. For instance, if you don't have enough calcium, you'll leach the calcium out of the bones, get rickets, and your horse will die. Either it'll go in a coma first, or its bones will just be too soft. And that's what happened in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when the horses were worked harder to plow the fields to get the grain in, because all the farmers, or all the people who had small farms who got their own grains, decided to go into the cities in the Industrial Revolution, work in factories, and the cities grew, but all these people still wanted their bread, their pasta, etc. And the grains were left out. Pardon me. The grains had to be grown by fewer people with larger plots of land and fewer horses. So the horses ended up working hard. And in that, they ran out of energy. So they were given grain. That's how the grain started, actually, in being fed to horses. And grain by itself will leach out the calcium from the horse's bones. And they were all dying of rickets. So somebody came along with monocalcium and dicalcium phosphate, which you see on every grain bag that you have in your barn. If you still have them, you'll see dicalcium phosphate, because they're trying to dump the calcium back in to the body to prevent rickets. Of course, as you increase the calcium and phosphorus, you decrease the absorption of magnesium, and all these horses become hyperexcitable with hypomagnesium, low levels of magnesium. Okay. So we're just going to draw a line here. So we have air, water, the polyphenols, and minerals and vitamins. So we're not going to really talk about that, because that's not what we need to understand. We need to get down to the core principles. And number 5, I'm going to list as protein. Now, protein should be your focus. In other words, in your diet and in your horse's diet, you should concentrate on eating an adequate amount of protein first, before anything else enters your mouth. You have to make sure that you have enough protein eaten throughout the day. It's just how our bodies work, and we'll get into that at another podcast. Number 6, we're going to call it fats. And it's interesting because I've yet to see a horse pour olive oil or Wesson oil or vegetable oil, corn oil, whatever. I have yet to see a horse get that. So the question is, where does a horse get its fat? And we'll go over that at another time. So don't worry about that. We're going to focus on the last, and that's glucose. And another name for glucose is carbohydrates. And I can't talk and write at the same time, but we hear so many words for glucose. Sugar. How about saccharides? And what else? Sugar, saccharides, carbohydrates, starch. We hear starch a lot. We hear structural carbohydrates. I'm going to call carbohydrates CHO, just carbohydrates, carbon, hydrates, hydrogen, oxygen, and of course, non-structural. I'll abbreviate that CHO. And this is called SC, and this is NSC. And a lot of people are talking about these things. And this is what I want to clear up today, because until you understand glucose, how important it is, but how unessential it is. And you're going to understand the difference. If you don't get glucose, you die. It's just that simple. Glucose is your primary fuel. It is the fuel that goes into the furnace and gives you that burst of energy to run away from the threat, or to even jump and play. If you're a kid or the foal is bouncing around outside, they're burning their glucose, but it's not essential. In other words, they don't have to eat glucose to get it. And that's one of those little tidbits that if you get that one tidbit out of this podcast, you're going to be miles ahead. You do not have to eat sugar to have sugar created. And I'll get into that in a second. So let's keep going here, because there's so much to talk about that I want to keep this going. Okay. There's things called elements. So you have a molecule, and a molecule, let's just call it water. Let's just say water. So water is a molecule made of one oxygen and two hydrogens. Now, I don't care what level of education you have. Most people know that water is called H2O. It's been called that forever. That is a chemical formula where two elements, or two hydrogens, two elements, hydrogen, oxygen, mixed together as in a 2-to-1 ratio, two hydrogens, one oxygen, and that equals water. And water, of course, can be frozen, it can be vaporized into steam, or it can be drank in a warm or cold drink. But that's water, and we all know that. I just want to build on this, and I'm going to bleed over into fats and proteins briefly, and I'll repeat this a million times, but all sugar, and again, sugars, carbohydrates, saccharides, whatever, all sugars are carbon, hydrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. All right. And if you're just listening to this podcast, driving your car, mucking your stalls, and you want to see this, we're going to be posting it on our Facebook page. It's going to be podcast, I believe, 108. And you can look at all these notes, and I'm scribbling down on my little whiteboard so you can understand it better. So water is H2O, and all sugars, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, or CHO, or carbohydrates. And that's where it comes, that's where the word comes from. And what's interesting is all sugars are formed in a ring. And I'm drawing a ring of 6 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And off of these are oxygens and hydrogens, and they're set up in a certain way. But I also want to let you know that it can be this way. I can put 5 carbons in a circle. And instead of putting carbon on here in the ring of 6 carbons, I'll put an oxygen with a carbon off of there. That's still legitimate, but it's a different sugar. So when I talked about the different sugars, which included fructose, sucrose, lactose, etc., that's just the way the elements are put together, and they make a unique sugar. Just like you and your, friend, spouse, whatever, you both look like humans, or you have a couple of horses in the barn. They all are horses, or maybe there's a horse and a pony, but they're all made up of the same stuff. And but they're put together a little bit differently. So that's what happens if you arrange the elements in different ways, you'll get a different sugar. But I always want to talk about glucose because that is the big one. Now, we're going to take a little side trip, a field trip, if you will, and we're going to go out on the land, and we are going to draw the land, which is, I don't know, green and blue. And we're going to put up in the sun, in the corner here, the sunshine. All right, so we have the sun. And what's really interesting about this is the sun will take carbon dioxide, CO2, which is what we are breathing out right now, and it's going to take water, H2O, and it's going to combine these two. And with the sunlight hitting it, it's going to give you C6, H12O6. That's the chemical formula for glucose. And this is really important. The sun, when it comes down on green plants, I forgot to mention that. So you got green plants here, which you call grass, and other things that horses like to eat. And they are going to take carbon dioxide and hydrogen and water, and they're going to make glucose. All right. There's an idea that I want you to just briefly think about. I know each and every one of you has gotten hay delivered to your barn. And the hay, it comes in a truck, a pickup truck or bigger truck, a semi-trailer. And you're asked to throw it into the hay loft or into the barn or the stalls, wherever. And it is so important to stack it right, because the better you stack the hay, the more hay you can put into the room, right? The more hay you can put in the hay loft. You don't want to just throw it in willy-nilly. Well, the plants want to do the same thing too. They stack their glucose molecules in a very structured way. So they're going to take a glucose molecule and they're going to glue it to another glucose molecule, to another one, to another one, to another one. I sound like a stuck record. So you can have thousands of glucose molecules in a long chain. And guess what we call that? We call that starch. So starch is basically the plant's way of storing sugar. If you just for a moment want to just step back and ask yourself, what do animals do with their glucose that they eat? They store it in their muscles and liver as glycogen. If you've ever heard the word glycogen, that's what it is. Animals store glucose as glycogen, which is long strings of glucose and branches. And plants store glucose as starch, and that starch is in long strings, straight lines. And that's called starch. It's also called non-structural carbohydrates, NSC. And every animal on the planet, that's you, your horses, your dogs, your cats, your pet earthworms, your chickens, and you name it, they can take starch and digest it with an enzyme that's in our mouth and further down in our intestines. And they can break that starch down into glucose. So when you eat a root vegetable, i.e. a potato, that potato is a starch bomb. It is a sugar bomb. It is loaded with glucose that once you eat it, it will satisfy your sweet tooth as well as anything. The reason why it doesn't seem to satisfy you is because glucose is basically tasteless. I mean, it doesn't have a bad taste, but compared to fructose, which is the sugar of fruit, it's bland. So when you eat ripe fruit, it tastes sweet and succulent. The peach, the cherry, the apple, whatever it is that you're sinking your teeth into, that's the fructose you're tasting. And it's inviting, it's intoxicating, and you want to eat more and more of it, which is what the plant wants you to do. So you will jettison the seed, or if you swallow the seed, it won't be digested because it's just this hard nut, and it comes out the other end in a pile of fertilizer, and the plant is thrilled, absolutely thrilled. You help seed the plant, no different than a bee pollinating plants, corn in the cornfield. That's what you're doing with hard seeds. So that's what's happening here. Now, let's take photosynthesis one step further. And I forgot to write that down, PHOTO, photosynthesis. That's a name you probably haven't heard about since 6th grade or something. But I'll never forget that that's all I learned in school. Nobody told me what happened at night. And when the sun goes down, the grass grows overnight. Maybe you've heard of that expression. Maybe you know from experience. But what the plant does is it takes every other glucose molecule and physically flips it upside down. So you're going to have your first glucose molecule looking right, but then your second glucose molecule is going to be upside down. And it's going to be glued back together between two right side up glucoses. So now you have this chain of glucose molecules that is right side up, upside down, right side up, upside down, right side up, upside down. And this is obviously important because we call this cellulose. So cellulose is what they call the structural carbohydrate. So cellulose is what gives the grass or the plant its structure. And that's also a carbohydrate made up of glucose molecules, but they're arranged differently. And how things are arranged is so important in how they're digested, because there isn't a plant, an animal on this planet that we know of that can digest cellulose. Now, I'm going to pause for a second, and I want you to think about that. If every animal on the planet can digest starch into glucose, why can't it digest cellulose into more glucose? Well, it can't. And what's really interesting is the bacteria in the gut microbiome. And the microbiome is, and I know you guys, if you've been with me for a while, you know that's all I talk about. But the bacteria in the gut microbiome will digest cellulose, all these glucose molecules. And guess what they develop it into? They digest it into a short chain. I'll tell you what that means in a second. Fatty acids. So basically, they become fat. So this is really, really interesting and so important. When I told you that a molecule of sugar is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, I wanted to let you know that it is in a ring structure. So it's in a circle, and it's a closed circle. If it were a ring, you could put it on your finger. But fat is also carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but in a string. So basically, it's carbon next to a 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 carbon, etc. For many, many carbon units. They can get as big as 22 plus carbons. And then off of these are the hydrogens and the oxygens. And I'm not doing a very good job of this, but I just want to let you know that these are in a string and not in a circle. So this is why when you eat your candy bar, it turns into body fat. And I'll tell you the steps that have to occur to make that happen. But this is why when you eat candy, it becomes fat. So basically, all sugar if it's in excess, it will be stored as body fat. It's that simple. So I'm not too sure where I am on this. I want to go in small stages. I'm going to do review, and I'm going to do a lot of reviews because I don't want people to get lost. But when you put food into your mouth, it's not inside of you until it's digested. And some of the things that it gets digested as, or gets absorbed through the tube, of course, is air, water, these polyphenols and minerals, proteins, fats, and glucose. And we're starting our focus on glucose, which is also known as sugar, or carbohydrates, or saccharides. And each molecule of sugar is made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in a ring structure. When the sun beams down on green plants, they take CO2 and H2O, and they turn it into molecule of glucose, and they store the glucose next to another, glue it in long strings, and that's called starch or non-structural carbohydrates. But at night, they flip every other glucose molecule upside down, so that becomes cellulose, and no animal on the planet can digest cellulose, but the gut microbiome bacteria can digest it, and they make something called short-chain fatty acids, which is basically fat. If you're interested, it's acetate, pyruvate, and butyrate. Butyrate's my favorite. Butyrate. You also might hear this as acetic acid, pyruvic acid, and butyric acid. They're the same thing. It's just two different ways of saying the same thing. Butyrate is what is butter. Butyrate is good. I put in my coffee. It is a short-chain fatty acid that can be broken down into what's called a ketone, and ketones can help supply energy to the brain. So now you understand what a sugar is. You also know that sugars in the plant can become cellulose, and when cellulose is eaten, it can become fat. So now you know that sugar can become either be used as sugar or it can be used as fat. So let's just skip along to the next important idea about sugar. I said sugar was important, but I said it wasn't essential. And the reason why I say it's important is because 20 to 25% of your glucose is used as brain fuel. So, in other words, of all the glucose that goes into your body, there's a certain portion that runs right up to your brain. Without glucose, your brain starts to run on empty. It becomes foggy. It starts to have events that you don't like. There's a bunch of information that is now in human literature talking about all mental illnesses, from anxiety and depression all the way out to schizophrenia, bipolar, PTSD, and seizures, is basically a lack of fuel going to the brain, and the brain kind of stuttering and trying to make sense of the world on a low tank of fuel. Or if you will, if you know anything about fuel in a car, it goes through the filter to get an adequate flow of fuel into your diesel or your gas. And if the fuel filter becomes clogged, which is inflammation at the blood-brain barrier, the glucose isn't going to get in there and do its job, and the engine's going to start to cough and sputter and not give you the power you want. They believe that's what's behind a lot of these mental illnesses that we have. And while you may need therapy, both chemical or pharmacological, I should say, and therapy, you're not going to get the best events or best solutions until you get the nutrition and the inflammation of the blood-brain barrier under control. So I kind of went down a little side path there because I want to bring it home, because everybody knows somebody's got anxiety and depression in this horse world. And if they're going out eating bagels and donuts and putting sugar in their coffee, you might want to tell them, hey, just stop for a couple of weeks and see if that improves your disposition. But 20 to 25% of all glucose goes into the brain. Oh, by the way, the high anxiety that you see in some horses can be alleviated once you reduce the amount of sugar going into them. I've seen that a bunch. So that's one of the reasons why the 2-week no grain challenge is so inviting, because in about 4 or 5 days, you had a brand new horse. The horse that you always knew was there, but couldn't reach. Okay, so glucose. It's important. The evidence is how much the brain requires it. But if glucose comes, okay, let's do it this way. If glucose, which is sugar, okay, sometimes I spelled, okay, glucose comes into the blood and it is unescorted. So alone, we'll just call it alone because I can't spell unescorted. Alone, it causes vessel damage. So if you have hyperglycemia, if you have high blood sugar, and we've all heard the term high blood sugar, what they're saying is that blood is tainted with molecules of glucose, which will actually damage the blood vessels, which helps start the process that leads to atherosclerosis and cardiovascular disease. And that is the #1 killer of humans on the planet, because you have high blood glucose. So you don't want glucose just running willy-nilly out there. To do that, you get an escort, a chaperone, if you will, and that is called insulin. And insulin is a protein that's made by the pancreas that grabs onto the glucose. So insulin plus glucose, I'll just put G, and that leads to safe travel, right? So insulin plus glucose equals safe travel in the blood vessels. So if you feed excess sugar above the requirements of need at the muscle level, then insulin has to do something with that glucose. It just can't release it and say, well, the cells don't want it. They don't have any room. What am I going to do with it? They have to just do something with it that doesn't kill you. And they've discovered that instead of just turning it loose, which will kill you, insulin will go to the liver. And sorry, if you're not watching this, I just made an arrow, and I made the arrow in the shape of L, and I started to write liver in the arrow. So crazy. Okay, and the liver, and they turn it into a fatty acid. So excess glucose will become a fat, and it'll be stored in a fat cell. So just remember, glucose in a ring is a sugar, and when glucose is spread apart and turned into a string of carbons, it becomes a fatty acid. And there's chemistry involved way beyond our expectations here. You can take organic chemistry if you want to learn how that's done. Okay, so that is basically what happens with glucose as it enters the bloodstream. So I know you all are dying to figure out what insulin resistance is, and I'm going to give it to you in a very easy to remember short story. Okay, and then once we figure out how this happens and how it affects protein and leads to chronic protein deficiency, I'll think my thing on glucose will be done. And then I'll review it next time, and we'll move on to fat, and then we'll move on to proteins. Okay, so glucose plus insulin, whoops, hey, come back here. Okay, glucose plus insulin travels in the blood to a muscle cell because the muscle cells use a lot of glucose. And when it's in the muscle cell, it can be stored. And that means it's stored as glycogen for future use, or it can be used. And that's called, well, let's just call it burning. If you want to really know what it is, call it glycolysis. 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 Okay, so I want you who's listening to this, I want you to think of you being a muscle cell. And this muscle cell is a house. It has a front door, it has a bunch of windows, and it has a kitchen. And in the kitchen, it has pantries. And in the pantry is where you're going to store your food for future use. So I'm Mr. Insulin, and Mr. Insulin is, he's kind of cool. He carries around a molecule of glucose and he comes knocking at your door. Knock, knock, knock. And you say, who's there? And I say, I'm Insulin. I've got some glucose for you. And you say, oh, great. I could use some. My shelves are bare. So you send your butler. Isn't this a fun story? You have a butler, and we're going to call it GLUT4, GLUTF, and then the number 4, GLUT, the number 4, GLUT4. So GLUT4, he comes to, it's a butler, sorry. It could be a woman, I don't care, just leave this alone. It's a butler who goes to the door. He opens the door, and on his way to the door, he has made a tube inside your house. And I, Mr. Insulin, cannot fit through the door, but my glucose can. So I throw the glucose into the tube, and it tumbles down the tube into your kitchen. And at the kitchen, you're just sitting there, you're having your meal, no stress, and you're going to take that glucose and you're going to store it over here as glycogen. And you might put a couple of molecules into the fireplace to burn it so you can have a little bit of heat or energy. All right. Now, the whole purpose of storing glucose is in case you're just doing nothing and all of a sudden around the corner of the barn comes a black bear, a grizzly bear, whatever kind of animal you want to think about that you might consider not petting, but maybe running as fast as you can. And to do that, you don't want to pick up the phone and ask for a delivery service of food, right? You don't have time for Amazon to swing by with a load of food. You want to reach right into your cabinets, throw food into the fireplace, glucose, and you want to burn it and get the heck out of there, right? That's what glucose is all about. You guys who are in sporting events, when your horse is getting ready and it's getting pumped up, it's starting to burn some of this glucose. But when you ask the event to occur, whether it's a racehorse, an endurance, well, not so much endurance, that might not be the best thing, but the start of any sport, you're going to dig in and you're going to immediately go to glucose and burn it. All right. That's where all the training comes from. And this is why everybody in the longevity field is now agreeing the more muscle that you have as a human, the more you'll be able to store glucose and the better your metabolism will be. So the more muscle, the more glycogen storage, better off you are. All right. Now, in your little house, you have a window, and through this window comes fat. Just like if you're sitting in your house right now in broad daylight and the sun is beaming through and the cat's laying in the sunshine inside the house, it could be 20 degrees outside or whatever it is in Celsius, about 2 degrees out. And actually it'd be minus 5, something like that. Anyway, it's cold out. It's below freezing. Yet the sun coming through the window is warm and it passes through. There's no knocking of the sunshine saying, hey, would you let me in? It just flows in, and fat will flow into the cell just like sunshine. It doesn't have to knock at the door. It doesn't need GLUT4 to come by and pick it up or do anything. It just flows in. And what flows in is something called a triglyceride. And a TRI means 3. And when that triglyceride breaks off one fatty acid and lays it by the fireplace and starts stacking the fatty acid in there for use in the fireplace, you're left with a diglyceride, or 2 fat molecules stored. And what you don't know in this drama that I'm making for you guys, so you won't forget what happens, is the diglyceride is jealous. It gets really upset. It says, why am I doing all this work, bringing all this fat into the cell? My fat is a much better fuel to use. It's more efficient. It's clean burning. There's no free radicals. You throw it into the fireplace and man, you get more than twice the amount of energy from my fat than you'll ever get out of a glucose molecule. What are you doing throwing in all the glucose in there, which is like your kitchen garbage going into the fireplace and burning black smoke and stinking? And you, the owner of the house, says, I'd love to help you, but I've got all this sugar coming to the door. I don't know what to do with it. I have to do something with it. I'm burning it because there's no more storage for it in my glycogen. So I have to get rid of it. Well, the jealous glyceride says, well, I'll fix this. And it goes to the butler and sabotages the butler. So now the butler can no longer go to the door and answer it when insulin comes knocking. Does that make sense? If you don't understand it, think about this. You have just resisted Mr. Insulin. And you have just learned how insulin resistance occurs. It is not hard to understand. But when your body is consumed with glucose and burning it because you have so much in abundance, it has trouble switching over to use the fat. So it starts the storage process of fat, which is what we call intracellular fat. So in humans, in 20-year-olds that are sedentary, they're just computer gamers and they're just sitting around, what they found in muscle biopsies is the fat starts to accumulate within the cell. It's the first sign of insulin resistance occurring in 20-year-olds. Whereas the 20-year-olds that are on the lacrosse team, the soccer team, the football team, they don't have storage of fat inside their cells because they're burning everything that goes in. Got it? So I just described to you what insulin resistance is. That's what insulin resistance is. Okay? So I'm just gonna, stop. So insulin resistance, what everyone is calling IR, now you know what it is. It comes from excess glucose coming in, and there are other reasons for it, right? But insulin resistance is basically that. And you get increased body fat. You get increased, the reason why you get increased body fat is because now insulin has this molecule of glucose and it goes to the liver and says, hey, can I store it in your glycogen? They say, sorry, we're all full here too. It goes to the brain. Hey, I've got more glucose. He says, hey, we're overwhelmed with glucose. And because you're eating processed foods with a bunch of chemicals and additives that don't belong there, you're also inflaming the gut membrane or the blood-brain barrier membrane. So now glucose that's trying to get into the brain without insulin, yes, there is a back door, has trouble getting in there. So the brain starts to starve even though there's glucose there, because insulin resistance is occurring even at the blood-brain barrier. This backdoor entrance of glucose into the muscle cell is promoted through exercise. So if you do strenuous exercise, you can actually force glucose into an insulin-resistant cell with what they call insulin-independent transport, which is kind of interesting phenomenon, but we aren't going to get into that. We want to stay with the basics here. So now you have insulin resistance. All the glucose is going into the fat storage, right? Because you don't want high glucose in your blood. So insulin is going to drive that glucose into the fat cell as a fatty acid. So the liver is going to convert it from sugar, and it's going to become a fat and stored in the fat cell. So, and what's even more important is another job of insulin is to stand guard at the fat cell and not let the fat out, which makes sense because if you're living in a world where sugar is abundant, you have all this fruit, it's near the end of the growing season, and you're putting apples and squashes and vegetables and all this stuff, and you're filling yourself up, you start to gain body fat because the body knows that winter is coming. And when winter comes, you don't want to be left, open. You want to have reserves. So the reserves are your body fat. And when the glucose goes away, insulin no longer has a job. So insulin, through something called just attrition, it has a half-life, that insulin is going to be degraded and goes away. And now it's good twin brother glucagon can come by and open the door of the fat cell and start letting the fat out of the fat cell, and it starts going to the muscle cells and pouring through the window, so to speak, right through the membrane into the cell. And the cell is going to say, you know what, we don't have any sugar, let's start burning fat. And now the mitochondria, and that's the word of that is the organelle that we're calling the furnace. The mitochondria says, yeah, I can do both sugar and fat. I can go both ways. But I was stuck. All I was doing was eating sugar, and I was having trouble getting over to burning fat. And that's what happens with a lot of obesity. They're just so stuck on using sugar for fuel, they can't use their fat. And it's called the opposite is mitochondrial flexibility. You want that flexibility to go both sugar and fat and other fuels. You want that flexibility. That's a healthy mitochondria. So let's go back to one other thing. We're going to go back to the brain. And the brain, again, remember, uses 20 to 25% of all glucose. But if there's insulin resistance plus inflammation, and inflammation. And inflammation can occur for multiple reasons, but it's usually the inflammatory foods that you're feeding your horse, and that bag of food that has 15, 20 different ingredients, and half of which you can't pronounce. They can cause some inflammation at the blood-brain barrier, and the bottom line is decrease glucose. So the brain basically says, hey, where's my glucose? All right. So again, abundant glucose is coming into the mouth. It's going through the digestive tract. It's being broken down. The free sugars are being broken down, and the starch is being broken down into glucose. That's being absorbed across the gut barrier, being taken up by insulin, running to the the muscle cells and the liver cells and the brain and other organs. And they're all saying, whoa, I have enough. My glycogen storages are full. The diglycerides are being jealous. They're shutting down the GLUT4 transport process. And every one of these tissues starts to exhibit something called insulin resistance, which basically says, I've had enough. I can't fit any more glucose into my cells. And that glucose is going to the fat cell and being stored as a molecule of fat, with insulin standing guard at the gate, not letting the fat cells out or the fat out of the fat cells. Okay. I want you to picture the obese person at the diner, sitting on the diner stool that is so obese, you can't even see the diner stool. It's just crazy. I mean, they're obese. And yet they're sitting in front of a stack of pancakes enjoying them. And your your thoughts go to the idea that this person has no willpower, what's wrong with them, etc. But in reality, this obese person, and I'm not trying to give kudos to them, but they are so efficient at storing excess glucose as body fat that if we had an event tomorrow that wiped out the sun and gave us an ice age, and all the plants died, and most of the small animals died, and there's very little food out there, guess who's going to last the longest? Because with no sugar, these obese people, obese horses, will start to convert their body fat over as a fuel, because body fat, by definition, is stored energy. That's all it is. It's just stored energy. There's no other purpose for it. I mean, there's obviously other purposes. It's a hormone regulator. Fat cells are. They release cytokines. They're part of the inflammatory process. I mean, I'm not dismissing how complex it is, but at a very root fundamental level, they will not release their body fat if insulin is doing its job. And insulin is doing its job only because glucose is coming in. And a lot of these obese people who go on a fasting diet will start to lose their body fat. And the Guinness Book of World Records has the largest person of 500 and I forgot how many pounds, over 500 pounds, with his doctor's help over in London, I believe it was, or someplace over there, went on a water-only fast and did that for a long time and got his weight down 180 pounds. It's pretty amazing, but that's what it's, in his case, it was extreme. That's what he had to do. Water only for, I would believe it was 380 days, over a year. He just drank water day after day after day, and his body converted the body fat over to energy to keep him going. Now, before we all go on this, starvation diet and lose the body fat, which will work, I want you to understand one more concept, and then I promise I'm going to let you go. I told you I had to touch on proteins for a second, okay? So a protein is a very, very large molecule. And these large molecules are made of smaller molecules called amino acids. And the amino acids are like letters of the alphabet, and the protein is like words. And you know how many words are in our dictionary. You might not know the exact number, but there's thousands, if not tens of thousands. But we also know that there's only 26 letters. There's only 26 letters in our American language, A to Z, or as you guys over there call it, Z. All right. And there might be more or less depending on what language you have, but in English, it's 26 letters, make up, thousands of words. Well, in proteins, there are about 20 amino acids, I abbreviate AA, 20 amino acids that make up the billions of proteins per cell. All right. So there are so many proteins in the cell. I told you about GLUT4, the transport, the butler. That butler is made up of at least 4, if not 5 different proteins just to make that one particular enzyme. All right. And then insulin is a protein, and it goes on and on and on. There's so many proteins that are all, so critical to the function of life. And they're all built out of 20 amino acids. And of the 20 amino acids, you have 10 that are essential. And I'm throwing this in here now because I want you to understand that the word essential, which means they have to eat them. They can't make them. They have to eat them. All right. And all amino acids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just like, sugars and fats are, but they also add nitrogen. All right. Now, when the brain doesn't get enough sugar, the brain sends a signal to the liver and says, if you have some amino acids coursing through there, I want you to take the nitrogen and cut it off and make carbon, hydrogen, oxygen into glucose. All right. So the process is called gluconeogenesis. because that means glucose, neo, which means new, genesis, which is the creation of gluconeogenesis. And right now, if you're a natural, normal, healthy individual, about 15% of all the sugar that you need in the day comes from gluconeogenesis. So this is why I say glucose is important for life. You cannot live without glucose, but it's not essential, because if you don't eat the essentials, we'll make it. And guess how it makes more glucose than the 15%? It breaks down protein. So, in other words, muscle, i.e., your top line, connective tissue. So, in other words, your suspensory ligaments, your tendons, your joint fluids, your articular cartilages, these are all proteins. They're breaking it down. How about neurotransmitters? Cushing's disease is a neurodegenerative disease that I believe is basically chronic protein deficiency. And it's chronic protein deficiency brought by the conversion of amino acids into glucose, because you're feeding your horse excess sugar, which insulin is sequestering and taking it out of the system and storing it as body fat, because the body is saying, hey, I'm getting signals that we're about to head into winter and we best have some body fat around or we're not going to make it through. The problem is winter never comes, because when winter does come, you keep putting sugar in the mouth. So they're getting sugar 24/7. So the signal is basically saying, produce more insulin, store more glucose as body fat, increase your body fat weight. Brain says, hey, where's my glucose? Glucose isn't coming. So the liver takes gluconeogenesis, takes it from your muscles, your immune system, your connective tissue, your neurotransmitters, your enzymes. All these proteins are breaking down constantly, but instead of recycling and building proteins again, off they go to the gluconeogenesis factory so the brain can keep functioning. And if you don't believe this, let me just end this by saying simply, if you don't believe this, I want you to think of any starved animal you've ever seen, whether it's a documentary or in real life. The first thing that goes in any animal that doesn't get food is the body fat. Why? Because there's no more sugar. If there's no more sugar coming in, insulin goes away, the body fat doors are opened up, the body fat starts to leave, goes to the cells, and they use the body fat to keep going, right? But when all the body fat is gone, the brain is still screaming, hey, I need sugar. Well, all along, as the body fat is giving fuel for the muscles, because there's no food, the muscles are being consumed and made into sugar. At some point, there's no more fat left. And at some point down the road, there's no more muscles left. It's a walking skeleton. Next stop is death, because the brain can't function anymore without glucose coming in. By the way, as the fat goes burning off and there's not much sugar around, some of that fat can become ketones, and the brain can use ketones to function. It's a brilliant fuel. And if you want to become a little bit sharper in the brain, get a little bit of ketones going, and those ketones will help. Or medium chain triglycerides, specifically caprylic acid, which is an 8 carbon length. Oh, here I go. I'm overwhelming you. Sorry, I didn't mean to, but that's why I put caprylic acid and butter in my coffee every morning with 38 grams of collagen protein. I mix it up, and that's what starts my day. And that's what gets me my energy to give you this podcast, plus all the kudos that I get from people around the world who tell me that I'm making a difference. And for that reason, I am grateful for you tuning into this podcast and listening to me. So This week's podcast is done. It's all about glucose. It touches a little bit about fat and protein and how they're related. You learned that glucose is not an essential food group. You don't have to eat glucose, never do. You can cut glucose out, but your body will make the glucose by burning up the proteins, the amino acids. And so you want to keep a balance. Ideally, you want to have about a gram of protein and a gram of carbohydrates coming in at the same time, 1-to-1 ratio. And in horses, it's really hard to judge how much carbohydrates they're getting because the hay is always different and the pasture keeps changing. So we really don't know what their carbohydrate load is. But if you focus on feeding them the protein that they need, they will self-limit the carbohydrates going in because they're satiated. But that's a whole different story. Glucose is essential, it's important, but not an essential nutrient. And that's what I want you to take away. Glucose, if fed in excess, will cause insulin resistance by increasing accumulation of fat within the muscle cells and within the other cells. And they will stop accepting glucose. Glucose is sent to the body fat and stored as a fatty acid for future use. All body fat is fuel stored. If you have excess body fat, if your horse has excess body fat, it is because you're taking in more sugar than you need and probably overall more calories than you need. And we'll get into the first law of thermodynamics, which basically sums up calories in, calories out, which sounds so simple, but there's so many factors that affect it. And I'll get into that whole thing later on. But I just want to leave you with glucose. Glucose is sugar. Sugar is saccharide. Saccharide is monosaccharide, disaccharide, polysaccharides. The table sugar that you put into your coffee is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. And if you drink a sports drink that has high fructose corn syrup, or if you dip your nuggets into the hot mustard sauce at McDonald's, you can read that the primary ingredient in that hot mustard sauce is high fructose corn syrup, which is 55% fructose and 45% glucose. And it is a liquid sugar, which is going to it's going to slide right past your small intestine into your colon. And in the colon, it will disrupt the microbiome and can be probably the number one cause for colorectal cancer is liquid sugar in any form, including sugar in your coffee. So I hope I'm scaring a bunch of you. I don't have all the answers. I'm not a human doctor. I didn't take any nutritional training, but I am a veterinarian who is trained by a school, Cornell, who taught me how to think. And I got upset when I saw the epidemic of suspensory ligaments going on and the food companies telling me stuff that just didn't make sense. And so I started putting things together back in 2010, something like that. I don't know, maybe a decade ago. I started asking myself the questions. So I've been digging for a while. This is what I come up with. Stop feeding your horses grain. Stop feeding them excess sugar. Don't feed them 24/7 hay. Give them a chance for hormesis, which we'll go over in another podcast. But hormesis is the stopping of the insanity at the mitochondria and giving the mitochondria to clean up and repair itself. So the engine isn't working 24/7. It gets a chance to heal. And that allows for health. So there's no evidence anywhere that a horse is supposed to be fed hay 24/7. But the veterinarians aren't coming out and saying anything about it. The farmers aren't coming out and saying anything about it. But this one is. It's the abundance of glucose that is found in free sugars in the hay and in the starch in the hay and the starch in the grain. And these horses are getting more sugar than they know what to do with. If they're starting to get a cressy neck and fatty shoulders and fatty belly, that not only is excess glucose, but it's chronic protein deficiency that you're seeing right in front of your eyes. All right, that's it. It's time for me to hang up and put this together. I wish you all a very happy new year in 2024. This podcast is going to be on the platforms for a decade or more. And you're going to reflect back and say, wow, Doc T was at this in January 2024. Yes. And for probably a decade before that. So hopefully I'm not steering anybody wrong, and hopefully your horses will learn how to thrive in a human world. So please join me at thehorsesadvocate.com, become a member, help me maintain these new studios and the support I need to get it out there to the world. So and I can spend more time reading more articles and bringing you more information. All right, that's it. Doc T out. I appreciate your time here, and talk to you later. Bye. Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.